Kia ora everyone, this is almost everything you'll need to know about the forearm anterior compartment. The anterior compartment of the forearm is also known as the flexor pronator compartment because all the muscles within it are either flexors of the wrist or pronators of the forearm. Anatomists valuing clarity above imagination when they name stuff. There are 8 muscles in the anterior compartment. They can be divided up into layers. So the superficial layer consists of 4 muscles, the intermediate layer consists of 1 muscle, and the deep layer consists of 3 muscles. All of the muscles in the superficial layer, 4 muscles, have at least one head of attachment, one point of origin at the medial epicondyle here, which is therefore known as the common flexor origin. First up is pronator teres. It has a superficial or more superficial head of origin at the medial epicondyle and also a deeper head along the coronoid process of the ulna, and the two heads meet as they stretch across to the lateral border of the radius here. Incidentally, between the two heads of pronator teres runs the median nerve, so it runs between the two heads here as it moves towards the midline of the forearm and then extends into the wrist. The second of the superficial muscles is flexor carpi radialis. It originates entirely from the common flexor origin. It's a reasonably bulky, strong muscle, and its tendon attaches to the flexor aspect of the base of the second metacarpal. Next is a much smaller, scrappier little muscle. In fact, it's absent in up to 14% of forearms. This is palmaris longus. It has a small muscle belly and a long stringy tendon that extends down and blends with the palmar aponeurosis and flexor retinaculum at the wrist. It's mostly useful as a landmark muscle because the median nerve lies immediately lateral to it, and it's usually, when present, fairly prominent superficially in the wrist. So a useful landmark for, say, median nerve blocks. The last muscle in the superficial group is flexor carpi ulnaris. It has a one head of origin at the common flexor origin, and then quite extensive secondary origin for the more posterior head, I suppose, along the olecranon, so behind here, of the ulna, and then along the posterior border of the ulna. So quite an extensive posterior origin or proximal attachment. Its tendon extends and attaches to all of the pisiform, the hook of the hamate, and the base of the fifth metacarpal. Often in diagrams of the anterior flexor compartment, the flexor carpi ulnaris muscle seems relatively small and unprominent, but it's much more impressive when viewed from the posterior aspect, which reminds us, of course, of the old anatomist joke: what does flexor carpi ulnaris and Jennifer Lopez and jeans have in common? What do flexor carpi ulnaris and Jennifer Lopez and jeans have in common? Unfortunately, I can't remember the punchline, so sorry about that. Maybe you can look it up on the internet. The thing I like most about this photo is this guy here, by the way. I suspect he's on the phone to his cardiologist. Other interesting anatomical factoids: the ulnar nerve, which you recall had made its way to the posterior compartment, passing behind the medial epicondyle, makes its way back into the anterior compartment by passing between the two heads of flexor carpi ulnaris, and then travels along the ulnar border of the forearm underneath flexor carpi ulnaris, and the bicipital aponeurosis, which was an extension of the distal portion of the muscle belly / tendon of biceps, extends out and sort of corrals up to some degree the muscle bellies of the superficial layer of flexor pronator muscles. Very interesting. The next layer, the intermediate layer, consists of just the one muscle, which is flexor digitorum superficialis. It has a humero-ulnar head, again from the medial epicondyle, common flexor origin, and also from the side of the coronoid process. And it also has a radial head, which is just the proximal part of the shaft of the radius, and between those two heads there is a free edge, a bridge, if you will, of fibers, and flexor digitorum superficialis runs down and forms the 4 tendons for each of the digits, inserting each into the intermediate phalanx. And the free edge here, between here and here, acts like a bridge, and as such enables structures to pass underneath it, and structures pass underneath it. So after passing between the two heads of pronator teres, the median nerve passes underneath the free edge of flexor digitorum superficialis. The ulnar artery, having formed by the division of the brachial artery at the apex of the cubital fossa, also runs under the free edge of flexor digitorum superficialis and is covered by it as it descends and moves towards the ulnar side of the forearm. And also the ulnar nerve, once it passes between the two heads of flexor carpi ulnaris, is also partially under the cover of flexor digitorum superficialis. Finally, we have the third layer, the deep layer of muscles. All of these muscles have proximal attachments on the forearm bones alone, so none from the common flexor origin. The most distal and the deepest of them is pronator quadratus, this square-shaped muscle that runs from the distal anterior surface of the radius to the distal anterior surface of the ulna, or vice versa, I can't remember which, and it assists in pronation. On the radial side, finally, the thumb gets a flexor from the anterior surface of the shaft of the radius and part of the interosseous membrane, flexor pollicis longus. The fibers all are directed towards a single tendon that runs up the medial aspect of the muscle. It makes it look like a feather that's been stripped halfway along. It's unipennate and is a useful landmark for surgeons, or if you happen to see a large deep wound of the anterior forearm, you may be able to identify flexor pollicis longus by this characteristic appearance. It inserts in the distal phalanx of the thumb. And lastly, flexor digitorum profundus, the deep flexor of the other four digits, arises from the anterior aspect of the shaft of the ulna and splits into four tendons, one for each of the fingers, and attaches to the distal phalanx, the base of the distal phalanx of each. And it's on mostly the belly of flexor digitorum profundus that the neurovascular structures that pass beneath the free edge of flexor digitorum superficialis lie. So the neurovascular plane, the main neurovascular plane of the forearm, lies between flexor digitorum profundus and flexor digitorum superficialis, and that protects those structures very effectively. Perhaps we'll just draw them in for clarity. The median nerve, ulnar nerve, and the ulnar artery. The radial artery remains relatively superficial, just lying underneath the cover of brachioradialis. However, that's quite a substantial muscle, particularly in the proximal part of the forearm. In the previous picture, I just built the layers back up again, so you can slow forward through that if you'd like to go through that as an exercise. Also in your books there's this lovely table and also some much tidier diagrams and a bit of text to read and absorb, so I'd recommend you follow through with that. Apart from that, that's almost everything you need to know about the anterior compartment of the forearm. Obviously next video we'll consider the posterior compartment of the forearm, but until then, enjoy the rest of your day. Ka kite.